Good afternoon. Welcome to this public meeting of the Standing Committee of Tynwald on the Constitutional, Legal Affairs and Justice. And I'm Tanya August Phillips, MLC. I chair this committee. With me are Laurie Hooper, MHK, and also Stu Peters, MHK, and our clerk, also Clerk of Tynwald, Jonathan King, Dr. Jonathan King. Today, we'll be taking oral evidence from two former Chief Ministers as part of our inquiry into the ministerial system of government on the Isle of Man. Welcome. For the benefit of Hansard and anyone listening, please can you both introduce yourself?
Tony Rowan, former Chief Minister.
And Howard Quayle, former Chief Minister.
Thank you very much. And would either of you like to make an opening statement of any kind before we get going?
No.
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 Okay.
We wait for the questions with excitement.
Lovely. So, as you'll be aware, we've had a conversation with Sir Miles Walker as well as part of this inquiry. So we would sort of going back to some of the original aims of the ministerial system of government. What do you believe were those original aims in it, respectively?
I'll give deference to age before beauty because Mr. Brown lived both sides of the ministerial system, so I'll go first.
Yeah, I mean, the ministerial system was actually quite straightforward why it was introduced, and that was to make somebody responsible for the government of the Isle of Man. When we had a board system, nobody was responsible for anything. We had a chairman of the Executive Council who had no powers. We had something like, I think it's 26 boards of Tynwald who were all autonomous. The only big fight was straight after the general election when the members who wanted to be on Executive Council, as it was then called, made sure behind the scenes they got the jobs which were appointed by Tynwald so that they were in power. So in other words, the old guard made sure they kept control and the new members were then given whatever was left. And basically you had these 26 autonomous boards doing their own thing, answerable to nobody, virtually not even answerable to Tynwald. They were answerable to Tynwald, but they were boards of Tynwald. I think most importantly is at that stage, because of the vacuum that had been created from when the governor presided as the chairman of the Executive Council and president of Tynwald and president of the Legislative Council, in using those terms, it created a vacuum. And the vacuum meant that there was nobody in charge and virtually nothing got done. I mean, the board system was very cumbersome. It delayed everything. There was no central policy. There was no clear policy. There was no budgeting policy. The budget was determined by 3 members of Tynwald who were the finance board, and what they said went. We used to have 3 or 4 days of what they called the Green Book debate, which was on all the ambitions of all the boards, which were not controlled. Always headlines in the papers saying, look at the millions they're asking for, which were just totally unrealistic anyway. It was just they threw them in the book because it was a good way to get something. And after 4 or 5 days, predominantly talked, dare I say, about farming in those days, you ended up with the Treasury or Finance Board, as it was, going away, coming back a few weeks later with a budget that they'd already decided before the debate anyway, and nothing was changed. And basically, the island was ruled by the Finance Board, and it was ruled by finance. In other words, if there was no money, there was no money, you couldn't have it. The minister, because of I mean, I can only talk from 81 when I got elected. I was in that system. It was horrendous, to be honest. There was nobody in charge of legislation. The Attorney General was the person who decided the legislation, and he issued whatever legislation he felt the island needed. It went through Executive Council, who just said yes, that's fine, and as a member the Speaker would give you a letter on a Friday usually and say, this is a bill you're taking through the keys, and you'll be taking it through the keys in a couple of weeks, and you hadn't even seen it before that. And the whole system was just a mess, to be honest. So there was no planning, no forward planning, no budget planning in the real sense. There was by Finance Committee, board as it was, but not properly done in terms of the political influence of the financial situation. And critically, what the members decided, and it was set up by a select committee, we didn't import people to tell us how to run the Isle of Man. We sat down and worked it out ourselves. And basically the strong view from the members of Tynwald at that time was that we had to have somebody politically responsible for the good governance of the Isle of Man. They recognised the vacuum. They also recognised, and it's still important today, that Tynwald as a parliament is a non-political dominated party system. So in other words, the vast majority are independents, and use that as a foundation to build on, which creates a unique system. A unique system that lots of people don't understand, but works. It works if the commitment is there to make it work, but the structure itself works. And I would say that the ministerial government in the Isle of Man is the most superior system in any of the Crown dependencies. It's a proper system where the Chief Minister can be held to account if that's the wish of Tynwald. The Chief Minister has a responsibility, as I'm sure you'll hear from my colleague here, has the authority to make sure his ministers or her ministers do their job, and if they don't, then there are consequences. And as long as it's done properly, the Isle of Man prospers. And I think it's fair to say, and some of it was because of world circumstances, as it always is anyway, the Isle of Man was prosperous because once we put in being a ministerial system with a Chief Minister and got over the initial stage, which was initially the Chief Minister had to go to Tynwald to get his team approved, which was an absolute disaster because by statute we made it that the ministerial team was a minority within Tynwald, and still is. But of course, when you go to Tynwald to get approval for the minority, the majority, and you've only got to have a few of them, and it did happen, who were not happy because they weren't in the ministerial system, went all out to make sure Tynwald didn't vote in support of the ministerial system, of the team the Chief Minister wanted. And so we subsequently changed that so that the Chief Minister was the one Tynwald elected, and the Chief Minister then appointed his team, and he was totally, or she, but it's been he up to now, was totally responsible to Tynwald for the actions of himself and of his ministerial team. And to me, that's a very focused way of making sure that people perform. And if they don't, then Tynwald has a duty on behalf of the people of the Isle of Man to sort it out. So that's my starter for 10.
Thank you.
Right, I'll try and be more succinct, but I think there was a quote that Alan Bell made, which I thought summed up the board quite well. The board system, 27 disconnected parliamentary committees, a recipe for chaos and confusion. And from speaking to other people, obviously Tony Brown has just confirmed that, having lived it. I fortunately didn't live it, but I think if you go back to the 60s, Sir Charles Carrouche, when he went away on his Commonwealth trips, came across the ministerial form of government and recognised that it was the way forward. I don't think he got his way till the department system was introduced by Act in 87 and Comyn was introduced in 1990. But compared with where it was, it's massive steps. Now, I always use a phrase which you probably shudder with my Latin phrases, but qui non profecit, if you don't advance, you lose ground. So I do welcome this committee's review of ministerial government because it's vastly superior to what was in place before. There are always ways of improving something, and things evolve. And I think on the Isle of Man we've been very good at evolving our parliamentary system. So the board system, terrible, replaced with Council of Ministers, but you know yourselves there's been several changes made to the Council of Ministers, restructuring. Mr Brown did one, and I think was it 2010?
I did.
It replaced 6 departments with 6 new, etc. And I was part of Change 2 in 2014. So it's evolving all the time, but it certainly replaced an incredibly inefficient system before that. And it's recognised. When I used to go away a lot on international trips, especially I lived in Westminster because of Brexit of all things, and that system is recognised. If you're a minister from the Isle of Man, they know what that stands for. They cannot, Jersey, Guernsey, I think we do have a better system than them when you analyse it. They're looking to improve, but sometimes their improvements were to catch up with the Isle of Man system, really. So I think there are improvements, but a significant improvement to what it was. Thank you.
I think, can I just add to that? I think the thing not to lose sight of is the principles of what was set up. And one of the major principles was by setting up a ministerial structure of government, you separated the Parliament from the government and separated the government from the judiciary and so on, which we'd never had before. And a good example I can give you is that when I was, when we first set up the ministerial system, and it was based on the board legislation until we got it changed in '87 with the Government Departments Act, we had to run until we could make the change in the law as if it was still the board system. So I was first appointed as chairman and minister of the board of Department of Social Security, and then when the law changed I became the minister of. But what was important, I think, to understand, which often people don't realise, when the Tynwald Order paper, the Keys Order paper, the questions came out, they had to be approved by Executive Council. So when we first became the new Council of Ministers, or Executive Council, sorry, it was in those days, the Clerk of Tynwald used to come in on the Thursday before the sitting of the Keys, or before the questions had to be in, and seek approval of the Council or the Executive Council, sorry, I keep jumping about, but anyway, when I say Council of Ministers, I mean Executive Council, and they had to approve them. And there were often questions where they would say, we're not having that question, and they were taken off the question paper. Somebody put a motion down, we're not having that motion, it was taken off the question paper, off the order paper. So the Executive Council in those days, because it had evolved from the Governor, where the Governor controlled, had tremendous authority on what members could and couldn't do. And so if a member asked a question, if the Executive Council said, we're not having that, it wasn't printed. And that was the end of it. So we evolved then, we said this was wrong, and we evolved into the Council of Ministers, where the Tynwald Order paper, the Keys Order paper, Legislative Council Order paper did not come to the Executive Government until it had been approved by the presiding officers, and then we got it like everybody else. And that was a massive step in terms of members having freedom to do what they felt was right for the Isle of Man, regardless of what government wanted. So that again was an evolution, and I think that's the point, you know, as Howard says, we've evolved bit by bit to make it work, and yes, there are always going to be readjustments. I think what is a concern is if there was a massive change which might be detrimental to the island, and the system can be very effective, without doubt.
So it was developed very much with the Latimer House principles then in mind, and the separation of powers.
Absolutely.
Can you just can I dig into that a little bit more? What specifically, what other problems did you come across at that particular point in time that then sparked that change, and then, you know, those conversations with Sir Charles Carouche internationally, and then, you know, what then came off the back of that? Can you give us some more examples?
Well, legislation, the Attorney General, so don't forget the Attorney General was Her Majesty's Attorney General, and therefore was very much influenced in those days by the Governor and what the UK wanted, because he was a UK appointee. And the Attorney General would develop legislation, and it depended on the Attorney General. I think we were very lucky because most of them were very Manx, would develop legislation that was required for the island, but did that without any political input. And the political input came at the end of the game. In other words, he went to Legislative Council, would say, we've got these new pieces of legislation we want to take through, and Council would have a row, and in the Executive Council some didn't want it, some did, but they couldn't stop it. It was then transmitted to the Speaker, and the procedures were different. When I was Speaker, I changed them because it needed me to sign a letter to appoint you to take a bill. I changed that and said, this is now inappropriate. It should be for the Council Minister to determine which minister takes a government bill through, not for the Speaker, who has nothing to do with government. So we made those changes, so they've evolved. But back in the 80s, the early 80s, 81 to 86, we had all this legislation coming through, and as I said, you could sometimes get 2 weeks' notice to take through a bill you had no idea about, you'd never even heard of before, and hence neither had the public. There was no consultations in those days. I remember having a conversation with William Kane, he was the attorney at the time, about what about a system of producing a white paper like they do in the UK, and he was very much in favour of that, but the system didn't really allow it until we got into a ministerial system. But we had, for example, legislation coming through. You could throw amendments from the floor without any notice, so bills were getting changed all over the place. You know, I could just sit here and write an amendment and say, Mr. Speaker, I want to move an amendment to this, and sometimes they went through because there was nobody collectively responsible, and you'd have lots of pieces of legislation where they're there and potentially have a major impact on the island, but they were passed. To some degree, the Legislative Council would try and control that, although ultimately the Keys controls, that's the system. But back then it was easier for the Legislative Council, they had more influence on that sort of thing. But an awful lot of bills in the Keys went to committees, and I remember being on something like 16 committees, because nearly every bill went to a committee because nobody in the Keys knew what it was about. So the only ones that got through were the complex ones, which nobody understood, and the ones that impacted everyday life, although the others did as well, but in a more understandable way, nearly always went to a committee. So we had select committees all over the place, and it was just, I mean, it was chaos.
So this wasn't just a change to, you know, sort of ministerial system of government, was it? This was a complete change between the way that each of the sort of branches of government or pillars of government communicated with each other, and what was appropriate from what wasn't under the Latimer House principles.
Yeah, it was a change in the democratic system of the Isle of Man.
Yeah.
I mean, lots of countries would have had a revolution. We did it gradually, and the same happened when we had the change in legislation to appoint the president of Tynwald, who was a member of Tynwald. I mean, these were major constitutional changes, and they weren't done quickly or lightly. They were done because of experience, and the world was changing, and there was a big danger of the Isle of Man getting left behind. And the ministerial system enabled us, one, to advance government in a more meaningful way, which again, you know, as mentioned in terms of it being recognised. My one criticism I have today is that the Chief Minister's been downgraded in his election by being only elected by the Keys. He needs to be elected by the Parliament, because it's anywhere in the world, the Parliament, if you don't have a party political system, it's a Parliament who elects a Chief Minister, not a branch. And you can't equate the House of Keys to the House of Commons. They're totally different, because the House of Commons is totally sovereign. The House of Keys is sovereign, but only within it being a branch. So our Parliament, whether people like it or not, and until they change it, is Tynwald. And so my view personally is that they've downgraded the status of the Chief Minister of the Isle of Man, because he's now not elected by the Parliament. That's a side issue really, but it's an important one. But this whole system was developed to make sure people understood a structure that was more or less acceptable throughout any democratic system, but recognised that Tynwald was not a party-led system, and until the people decide different, that's where it'll stay.
Thank you. Mr. Quayle, have you anything to add?
No.
At the back of that. Right. So looking back, since the system you know, was in place, in both of your experiences, has it worked well?
Well,
to ask a basic question.
I'll let Howard start first, because I've been talking a lot. It'll help my throat.
On the whole, yes. I think, having read various reports, there are a couple of changes I would have made. I think in my period I had what was known as the BBC years: Brexit, beneficial ownership and COVID, all things that were supposed to happen once in 100 years, and I had 3 of them on top of all the other off-island problems. But there was 2 areas that if I was sitting in here and looking to make change, that I would do. And I think one, if you want, they amended legislation, I think in about 2010 or 2014, where the Chief Secretary could instruct the CEO of a department. Great, it needed to be done. That was part of, you were getting away from that silo mentality where the Chief Secretary had clout over, but he had clout to instruct them to work with them and chair meetings. But there was an instance where there was a CEO that I just did not think was up to the job, and I'd wanted to replace, and I didn't have the power. The chief secretary didn't have the power. It was the minister of the department that had the power, and that, I don't know if that should have happened, but that's how the law is currently written. And short of sacking a minister, you can have new ministers come along, and the CEO will come into my look into my eyes scenario, and they're very reliant on a CEO, and that was something I would have changed. I didn't have the time. We were doing 100-hour weeks with COVID towards the end of the administration, so that's something I would have changed. And the other thing, I think under the 1990 Council of Ministers laws, I think the Treasury had too much power when it came to interfering with departments and government policy. Absolutely. And you could have three members holding up and interfering with the Chief Minister, who was elected by, in my case, Tynwald, with policies agreed by Tynwald, because we had the programme for government, which had been unanimously accepted by Tynwald members, and you could have Treasury members who had maybe their own personal view, who could hijack government policy. So again, short of sacking the entire department, Treasury had a inordinate amount of power, and I feel changes should have been made whereby the Council of Ministers, chaired by the Chief Minister, could have more say on where some of the money was going. So one of the things that was right before I became Chief Minister, you had the three subcommittees: the Social and Children's Committee, the National Strategy Committee, etc., the Environment and Infrastructure Committee. They allowed you to have cross-departmental teamwork effectively, and had you, as a Council of Ministers, more clout with the finances, you could have said, right, we're going to use one department's allocated budget to work with another department, because by going, especially with the children, I took over a pretty terrible children's sector. We had to make significant changes when I was made Minister for Health and Social Care at the time. We had those 2 tragic deaths, and when we had a review, there was lots of problems. So we put in lots of changes. We got departments working together, but he who pays the piper calls the tune, and it would have been far more efficient to give the Council of Ministers more financial power to enable departments where they had crossover, which you did have quite often, to work for a better good. So I think that's one area, that's a key piece of that. If I'd stayed on, which my family, I promised my family I was only going to do 2 terms, I stuck to that. If I'd stayed on, I would have pushed for that to have been changed, but there we go.
And just following on from that, I mean, it was recognised that we needed to change the Treasury Act, and that was never done, and it needs to be done. It's the one thing that stops the Council of Ministers effectively by statute controlling the budget. We relied, and certainly in my time when I was there, from 86 through to when I became Speaker in 90, whenever it was, we relied very much on the goodwill of the Treasury Minister to work with the Council, and certainly often where there were issues, Council would, when it was doing the budget, had a briefing, because this was all new. We'd never been briefed in a way that it was up to Council Ministers before. Treasury used to go into executive government and say, this is our budget, and whether they liked it or not, that was the budget. When the ministerial system came in, Treasury Minister was expected to brief the Council Ministers on what he proposed. he was expected to get his speech for the budget that was going to be made in Tynwald approved by the Council of Ministers. This was all quite alien to the Treasury because they'd been in charge, and I suspect it's still alien to the Treasury because Treasury is a different animal than the rest of the departments. One of my favourite sayings used to be when I used to get quite agitated, which was well known in Council of Ministers, and I would say to the Treasury Minister and his chief officer who was there, well, it's all very well you're questioning our budget. What about us questioning yours? Because you determined your own budget. And they used to sit back then and be very quiet. But the point is the Treasury Act is outdated. It needs amending for the very reasons really that Howard said. It's what I would say one of the most urgent to correct. It would help the ministerial system. Nothing wrong with the ministerial system, but it does rely on good working relationship between the Chief Minister and his team, and especially between the Chief Minister and Treasury Minister. And if there's any clash there, the system will not work because ultimately, as you've said, the Chief Minister can't direct the Treasury without getting Council Ministers to do that. And when we get to that stage, you've got a real problem if it comes out that the Council Ministers directed the Treasury to do X, Y and Z. So you need to change the law to recognise a ministerial system and that the Treasury are not alone anymore. That's certainly my firm view, and I think that's basically what you're saying, Howard, isn't it? So that's one thing that I think is important to make it more effective. But in terms of effectiveness, I mean, it can be as effective as people want it to be. The people who make it effective are not the ministers.
Yeah, there's a phrase, the rule of law is as long as the Chancellor's foot. So it doesn't matter whoever you've got system, it's the people.
Absolutely.
If you haven't got the right people. So, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, we know what we mean. I'm sure you do too.
That leads me quite nicely actually into this, because you've mentioned a number of times we don't have a party structure on there, which doesn't really exist in a big way on the island. So you talk about there some of the risks inherent in the system, and you have two ministers that maybe are on very different pages, Treasury and Chief Minister, and that causes some tension sometimes. One of the things that's often said about our ministerial system of government is there's no public mandate for the government, because the government doesn't stand on a manifesto and say this is what we're going to do. All that happens after the election. So you kind of, as a member of the public, you're not really able to direct that kind of government policy. Do you have any particular views on that?
Well, my view is it's, whether we like it or not, politics, even in the House of Keys elections, is personal politics. People vote for you because they like you, or they don't vote you because they don't like you. And to be blunt, it doesn't matter what you've done, how effective you've been, you're either going to get elected or you're not. The big advantage, that is a disadvantage in one way, but the alternative, and this is my view, is party politics, which in a small jurisdiction is a nightmare. Because when I went to CBA conferences during my time across the world, the biggest problems were in the smaller nations who were dominated by a party and had been for 20 or 30 years, because there was 20 of them in power and 2 of them in opposition, and it never changed. The Isle of Man has the beauty that people change it, because the people at Ramsey aren't voting for the man in Castletown, they're voting for the man in Ramsey, and vice versa, or woman. And the other thing is that it depends on the person. You don't have to be in a party to be effective. What you do is, if you care about the Isle of Man and you're in for the right reasons, you'll be good. You've got to work at it. It's harder, but that's not a bad thing, because at least it's not dominated by a party philosophy that might not be what the whole island wants. And, you know, bigger nations struggle. We're seeing one at the moment where there's a split in society. And you know, the question is it a bad thing? Well, the people of the Isle of Man don't think so. The thing about the House of Keys is you're elected, and suddenly 24 you come together, and you might not even know who 20 of them are. And you sit down in a room, but at the end of the day, in most cases, most members work together because they see they've been elected to do right for the Isle of Man, and they want to make the island successful. And as long as you've got that philosophy, the island can be successful. But it does mean it's a compromised government. That's not a problem. It means you sit down and talk, you work out the problems, make it work, do what you think's in the best interest of the Isle of Man. And as long as you know that your most important role as a member of the House of Keys is to be a legislator and not be a member of government, but if you can do both, that benefits the island even better, and certainly your constituency. And that's the philosophy I think most of us worked on.
Yeah, obviously, Laurie, I understand where you're coming from as leader of the Liberal Vannon Party, but I totally concur with what Tony has to say. You're elected first on trust, your reputation, and what people feel you stand for. And then when I was Chief Minister, did I expect to have to shut the island down? Events happen that you haven't got I didn't have a mandate to shut the island down. I didn't have a mandate to deal with Brexit or beneficial ownership. You come up with policy, I'm not saying on the hoof, but you have to react to what's out there. And therefore, I mean, if you look at the current Labour government and you look at the amount of things they've done totally different that they said they weren't going to do, because they're saying they found this 24 billion black hole, whether that exists or not. They had a mandate. They were elected on certain promises. They haven't followed half of them. So I think, yes, you don't have a mandate. I think when I bought the steam packet, I'd put it in my first manifesto that I believed that the island should own its strategic link with the United Kingdom. But other than that, I think the public go on, as Tony said, your reputation, what you stand for, your politics. I was probably at extremes, but you're elected by the people on those views, and as long as you stick to them, and then as I say, you have to change when you get in anyway, because events happen that you couldn't imagine would ever happen. So, yeah.
And I think you're right. I mean, lots of things that happen to you once you become a member, you never envisaged at all. You have the basics of what you want, because most of it, if you're standing, you say, I want to stand because I want to make sure the island has a good quality of life, I want to create opportunities, I want a good education system, a good health service system, and so on and so on. And most manifestos are very broad in that sense. They're not focused like a party system. And I can tell you now, my experience was that as long as you weren't outrageous in your manifesto, they voted for you because they liked you. You used to go knocking on doors, you'll have the same party or not, and come and have a cup of tea, and you start talk politics. Oh, I'm not interested in that. What about my garden? Because people want to yap. Some people are very focused on it. I mean, that's the difference in society. But I think what the island seems to be good at, even though the electorate don't talk together, is putting a variety of different styles of people into Keys, sorry. And that balances it all up in a way, in a funny way. And you get extremes. I mean, there's members I worked with in the House of Keys who, I mean, I was totally opposed to their policies, but when you were on a department, they were put aside because, yes, you worked where you could to help each other, but predominantly you were working to make sure the department was successful, so the Isle of Man was successful. So you had all these different things pulling you, but it depends where you come from, I suppose.
So you don't, neither of you really think then that there's merit in looking at alternative ways of electing a chief minister? So there's been conversation in the past about a publicly elected chief minister, for example. Do you think actually that would weaken the system as it stands?
You'd have a dictator. Simple as that. I mean, if I got elected by the people of the Isle of Man, and I've said this in debate in Tynwald because it was raised a few times, and I used to say, just imagine I get elected across the island as the Chief Minister of the Isle of Man and I get 40,000 votes, and you in your constituency have got 3,000 votes, and you try and tell me off. I can tell you what my answer will be. And if you want people then creeping to a Chief Minister, that will create creeping to a Chief Minister. The beauty about our system is the Chief Minister knows he's only there basically at the will of Tynwald, albeit he's elected by the Keys, it's only Tynwald can kick him out. So that in itself creates a control. You're conscious of Tynwald. I was always conscious, and I'm sure he'll answer for himself, I was always conscious that I was Chief Minister, but I was just one of a team. I was there to make sure the team worked together and gelled together as best we could, allowing for differences, and we set the system up to recognise those differences, but ultimately to lead Tynwald to go where we needed to go. And I think what's critically important is openness. The government has to be very open in the Isle of Man because it does not have a public mandate as a government. And the only way to do that is it seeks Tynwald approval for nearly everything it needs. And Tynwald says yes or no. I remember saying to people, we took some major policies when I was there, and and one got kicked out. And in the Isle of Man, it doesn't bring the government down, it's just accepted that Tynwald didn't want it. And I remember saying to a reporter once, but I've done my job. I believe that was the way forward. Tynwald disagreed, we move on. And if government doesn't respect Tynwald, the system doesn't work.
Yeah, I'll just add to Tony's comments, really. First and foremost, I agree. I'm the last Chief Minister elected by Tynwald. Tynwald, I had the support of the upper house and the lower house, and that's how it should be. I totally disagreed with divorcing the vote, so it was just a House of Keys elected Chief Minister. The Chief Minister needs to work with Tynwald. You're not a dictator. You've got to... But for the greater good of the island, everyone comes together. Difference of opinions, views, but I always thought at the end of the day, whilst some people would drive me mad, I hoped that they, in their head, they were doing what they thought was best for the people of the Isle of Man. And if Tynwald has voted on a Chief Minister, then they have the broad support, and a lot of my supporters never voted on some of the bills I was passionate about, but that was life. But you had the support of Tynwald, and when we're seeing in a distant country what happens when the public elect someone and what they're doing to that country at the moment. So I think, and as Tony said, you would have a super MHK if they were elected by everywhere. You know, if you're only elected with 700-800 votes, and you've got, as Tony said, someone with 40,000 votes, the whole island, then how are you going to rein in that person? I think the current mandate works admirably, and I think it would be a really bad decision to publicly elect. It's the same with the MLCs. If you have MLCs publicly elected, they would have a superpower then.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. Imagine somebody who's never been in the House of Keys or the Legislative Council decides to stand to be the Chief Minister of the Isle of Man by popular vote, and he's a nice guy, and everybody
and
loves him.
says he's going to spend all he's going to give you whatever you want.
And he's got a high public profile for other reasons, and he gets elected, or she, and yet they haven't got a clue about how Tynwald or Keys works, but they've been elected to be the Chief Minister of the Isle of Man. It would be absolute mayhem.
So kind of leading on from that then, now you'll both have had very different experiences with this, so the question I'd like to ask really is whether each of you thinks the Chief Minister as he stands wields too much power. And you've touched on the Treasury question already, and I appreciate, Mr. Pearl, from your perspective you had a very different experience towards the back end of your administration, because actually the powers you held as Chief Minister were quite different during COVID under emergency powers than actually would have been ordinarily held. But I suppose that's the question, as it stands as the office, do you think that the power the Chief Minister has is too much, or is the things that you would have said, actually we were allowed to do this during COVID, that maybe would have been beneficial, but more often? But it's an open-ended question for you both.
Well, I can only go from my, it's a personal view of our experience, and the absolute answer is absolutely not. Because it's like herding cats. You, as Chief Minister, you have one vote. You have one vote in Tynwald, and I always did everything by majority in the Council of Ministers. So I rarely lost, but occasionally I would lose the vote, and so you do. All the fine. I mentioned earlier the changes I would like to make with the Treasury Act, but that was purely because at the end of the day, we had a programme for government. It was approved by Tynwald. I was wanting to take it through, and then I had Treasury making changes, not saying they were going to do something in a department, and I didn't have the power other than sacking the entire team to say, no, I want, this is Council of Ministers policy, this is what I want, this is what I'm going to take through. So no, you appoint your ministers. Again, they're not all like-minded, and some are ultra loyal, some are you've got inside the tent rather than out, and so I think the vision that some people have that the Chief Minister is all powerful is not. You've got to be able to work with people, to take, as frustrating as it may be, but the Chief Minister only has one vote. Maybe if they're the leader of a political party, as Tony mentioned before, and they've got 300 votes that they can count on, then they've got that power. But when you're Chief Minister, as you are with a backbencher, you have to work with your colleagues to take something forward, and sometimes you don't get your way, but by working collectively together for the greater good, then you get what you think is best for the island. So I didn't think I had any superpowers, and I think the backbenchers would remind me if they felt I was going over above my station, which they did probably numerous times.
And I think it's fair to say that, and I was part of it when the Select Committee worked up a system to be what became what we now have, a ministerial system, was actually to ensure that no member of Tynwald was ultimately totally powerful. To use a term, we didn't want a governor, we wanted a government. And the idea of that government was that the Chief Minister was there to make a team work together for the good of the island. And clearly, the Chief Minister doesn't have too much power, and I think the system was designed and has evolved to continue that design, that he or she doesn't. The Chief Minister's job is persuasion, making the team work together for the best interest of the island, and in fact has an overview, because ministers are stuck doing their departmental work if they're doing that right, and they're busy on that. Chief Minister is busy doing the overall system, i.e. the external constitutional issues and so on, but also making sure the team works together in a way that doesn't create problems for the island. And I think that's right, because if you give too much power to the Chief Minister, he'll just tell you as a minister you're not doing that without listening to why you're doing it. And a lot of it is listening to why. Why has this minister and his department come to this conclusion? Justify it. And the Chief Minister is independent enough to be able to say, sat around the table to the ministers, why do you think this is important? And you have to justify it. And if you can persuade the Chief Minister, who's had very little to do with it, if anything, after the whole council having their input, thinks, yeah, okay, we can go with that, then you tend to find you go with it. Because you go to Tynwald to justify it, and you want the Chief Minister to be stood there backing you for the right reasons, not just because you're a minister, backing you because he thinks what you're doing is the right thing for the Isle of Man. So persuasion's important. Coordination. The Chief Minister acts, I think, as a strong coordinator between the ministers and the departments and the chief executives, especially chief officers, making sure that he questions things that he hasn't been involved in, so it's easier to question. Why are you doing this? Why do you think that's a good idea? And the Chief Minister's free to do that because he's not been involved in the detail. Another minister might ask a similar question, but might be a bit more volatile because he's looking at it from his department point of view. But the Chief Minister's looking at it the whole government point of view. Why is this a good thing for the Isle of Man? Persuade me. And I think that persuasion is important, and it goes both ways. And if you are able to thrash that out in the Council of Ministers and get a conclusion which is either yes or no, then the Chief Minister will back his minister, as will the team. And there is a let out for ministers if they really have a problem. The system was developed to allow for that because we're not a party political system. And as long as that's all recognised and acknowledged and respected, the system can work well. And my experience was it worked very well. But you had to make the team work as a team. That's critical. And the Chief Minister's power really is hire and fire.
Just before we move on to the structure of government, Mr. Peters will be taking that particular thematic part of the session. But the currently, and just to be a bit more political in the current day, but we have 10 ministers that are in the Council of Ministers at this particular point in time. Is that something that either of you would have done? When we're talking about sort of the separation of powers, we're talking about the balance of power between the executive and the backbench. in Parliament. I mean, how would that have worked for you? Would that have worked well? Is that something that you would agree
When
with?
the system was put into place, there was a deliberate and very conscious decision to make sure that the ministers were in the minority within the keys. And that was why they fixed on the Chief Minister and 10 ministers. And of course, although there's no law against it, in those days they were from MLCs as well as MHKs. It's evolved into, and I never had an MLC as a minister, it evolved into the situation that your ministers came from the keys. I think you need to leave the door open, because if you have a real problem in the keys, a Chief Minister must be able to call on experience within Tynwald, wherever they sit, because ultimately he controls them anyway. But in terms of the 10 is fine. Now, I know the excuse is used, and it was used all through my time, and sure, it was used all through Howard's time. Oh, it's a built-in government majority because that department's taken it, and there's 2 members on that department, and there's 2 members on Treasury. They're free to say no, because our system allows them to. I never sacked a member of my department because they disagreed with the decision of the department when it went to Tynwald, as long as they disagreed before it went to Tynwald, so that the minister knew when he went to Council of Ministers that he had 1 or 2 members on his department who said they didn't agree with this policy. Because let's remember, the department is the minister. The members are there to be advisors in a way. The minister can delegate to them, and they can act on behalf of the minister. But the members don't have power in the sense that the minister does. So the minister goes to Council of Ministers and says, I have 2 members of my department who don't agree with this, but I still think it's the right thing to do. Then the Council of Ministers will judge whether or not they think the minister's right or has actually gone a little bit too far because he's not accepted it. So in theory, and everything's in theory, you know, in theory, the government's still in the minority. But it doesn't mean that most of the time the minister's persuaded his members to support him because they've worked the policy up together and they agree with the way they're going. There are occasions where they don't. Always has been. It depends how the minister deals with it. Some ministers don't like that. Tough. That's the system.
Can I just ask, do you not think that's somewhat of an idealised view, perhaps? Because, I mean, you're right, in theory, those things can happen, but in practice, I don't remember the last time a member of the Treasury voted against the Treasury. In fact, it may even have been Mr Cannon, whilst he was Treasury Minister, voting against the Treasury policy would have been the last time I remember that happening.
But you can't answer for the individual because they're elected individually. But come back to what I said before, whether you like it or not, the Isle of Man system is a compromised system of government. And all I would ever say to a member, and I used to say this to my members, if you don't agree, say now. There's no issue. You got elected on a different mandate than I did. If you don't think that's the right policy, now's the time to say it. I want to be clear before I go to council, before I go to Tynwald, that you're against it. And if you stand up in Tynwald and vote against it, that's fine. I was a minister who stood up and defeated a policy on a new police station for the south of the island. And I persuaded Tynwald to throw it out, much to the annoyance of the then Chief Constable, who I was delighted to have annoyed. But I mean, the point was, he was wrong because the department was allowing the Chief Constable, Chief Constable was allowing the Chief Constable to dictate policy regardless of public need. So in the end, because I'd been fighting for about 7 or 8 years as a member for Castletown to retain the police station in Castletown, the headquarters for the south, and they wouldn't even look at the options, although they were handed on a plate to them, I said to the then Chief Minister, Miles Walker, I'm sorry, I am not going to support this in Tynwald. You can sack me if you like, but my policy has been known for the last 2 elections. Now, he respected that. I stood up in Tynwald and it got kicked out. And that was done by a minister. But the system allows that the constituency is important. And if you don't have that, nobody will want to be a Chief Minister or a minister because you can't act for your constituents, which ultimately you're going to do. I don't know if that helps answer it, but I mean, that's the system of compromise.
Yeah, essentially, the message that I'm really hearing quite strongly from you is, again, it depends on the person. If you have the right people, the system works well.
Oh.
If you don't have the right people, the system struggles to work well.
And that's across the world. Look at America today.
I'll give you a slightly different answer on that. During my time, we always had... We would look at a department with its number of members, look at the number of ministers and make sure that we did not have in any department, with the department members and the Council of Ministers, we never had a majority. because he should always. That's why I've always valued the bishop's vote, even though he wasn't publicly elected, because he or she now came up with a different viewpoint totally and a different way of looking at it from how I would look at it half the time. And as cross as I would be if I lost, I didn't lose a vote often because of the bishop, but I liked to think I'd won by winning the argument. I didn't go in with my block vote and just rubber stamp what I did. So I always kept 9 ministers, and I have to say to 2 of you here, I was surprised you allowed, as a Tynwald, as a House of Keys, 10 when you have a ministerial position of without portfolio. Well, that's the Cabinet Office.
Yeah.
Looking around, so whilst we were on difference of opinions on a lot of things on that, I will agree that it is really important, I feel, that a government wins the argument, that when it goes to Tynwald, it has, as much as I hated sometimes having to lobby and make concessions to get that extra vote when I thought I had a really good point. Well, we as a Council of Ministers had a really good idea, and we'd thought it through and we had all the answers to have, but that's how, so we never went over the 9, and we always looked to make sure that a department, if they had, their political members, you added that 9, you were never going to give yourself that 13, if you know what I mean. So, but that's on your heads. If I'd like to I think lucky, because if I'd have tried a 10th minister, I don't think you'd have stood for it. So maybe my powers of persuasion are poorer.
Well, minister without portfolio is what it is, and it's really, it never worked when we tried it before. I suspect it's not going to work this time. A minister has to have a clear portfolio. You can't pretend you haven't. And minister without portfolio, what does it really mean? We know what it means in the dictionary, but in politics, what does it really mean? Because we're not a party system. Again, a prime minister with a party will have a minister without portfolio because they're in the same party and they're doing it for a party reason. We're not, so why have it?
But policy and reform minister can go around all the departments looking at policy. Anyway, you've asked the question, you've got your answer.
Thank you. Stu?
Yeah, I've got questions about the structure of government, but I'd just like to go back briefly to an answer that you gave earlier on about the fact that Treasury in some ways is too powerful. And I wonder if that's because they are a gatekeeper rather than an enabler. And does it mean that as a government we are limited in the amount of entrepreneurship that we can look to, because Treasury sets a budget and then patrols it, kind of thing, rather than enabling departments to do things as such?
Well, I think first and foremost the job in Treasury is incredibly important. Job in Treasury, and you have to respect what they do. And some departments, in my 10 years there, did come up with some pretty harebrained ideas on, and quite rightly were rebuffed by Treasury. And at the end of the day, I went in when government wasn't running a balanced budget. We'd had the financial crash in 08, and one of the reasons I'd stood was to work with others to get the economy balanced. So some people elected didn't have that sort of, they just wanted to carry on spend, and therefore you do need a strong treasurer to say, look, no, we need to live within our means. But if the entire Council of Ministers have a strategy, and Treasury are saying, backbenchers are saying no, and outvoting the Treasury Minister maybe, then that, as long as it's that shouldn't be allowed to happen. And it didn't happen all the time, but it could impact policy. And so you can't allow departments to run away with spending. So you have to have a strong Treasury. So I support Treasury from that. So I want to put that down as a marker. I'm not saying Council of Ministers should run roughshod over and departments whatever they want, because you have in Treasury you have a bigger picture. You're spending what, £1.1 billion. You're getting X from tax, X from VAT, and X from receipts, and therefore you know what you've got. And if somebody's being unreasonable, so you've got to do a balancing act. But sometimes if two departments are working together to children, for example, it crosses over into two, if not three departments really, and if one department is cut, it can have a total impact on the other. So yeah, it's I'll leave it at that. Let Tony come in.
Yes? Okay, sorry, Chairman, I thought you were trying to get Mr. Peters' attraction if you...
Yes, just to ask a question, actually.
Oh, you want to ask a question? Oh, right. You mean you have to ask him if you can ask a question?
Oh, I'm letting him chair from this section. I'm being polite.
She's hurrying me up, that's what it is.
Oh, is that what it is? Oh,
No, sorry, you can carry on. Do it.
So, talking then about the power of individual departments, do you think the Cabinet Office has become too big?
Can I first, if I may, through you, Chair, add on to what Howard has said about the Treasury first, and I'm happy to come back with that. I have strong views about the Cabinet Office, but that's because I'm the old guard. I mean, my view has always been Treasury basically is the filter for government to assess what it can afford to do. It should not be the policy maker making policy by financial restriction. And I have to say, I think at the moment that's a real issue for us. Finance is more important than service. To me, service is more important than finance. But you have to be able to afford what you do, or otherwise you get into trouble. So to me, Treasury was always a filter to work through the departments for the very reason Howard said, because departments will ask for all sorts. And Treasury should assess, go through it, filter it. And don't forget, Treasury might be good, but they haven't got the answer to everything. Even though some officials might think they have. They actually often don't understand what's going on in the department, and therefore they're making their views out of semi-ignorance because they see it from a financial perspective. People don't live just by finance. Life is more than that. And my view has always been in government, how do we afford to provide the service to make sure the Isle of Man is successful? And there's lots of different ways for that, which are far broader than this. So for me, Treasury was there to filter and get down to a budget that was affordable, and then persuade me, and the Treasury Minister used to come in with his senior officers to me when I was Chief Minister and set out to me, before it went near Council Ministers, what their budget proposals were and why. And if I was content, then it went to Council Ministers. If I wasn't, I'd ask them to look at some things again. Then it went to Council Ministers, and again the Treasury and the Chief Officer had to explain how they got to the decisions they had, because sat around the table is every minister who has their own ambitions. Because as you become a minister of a department, you become involved in the department. You're there to look after your department, but you are part of a team, so it's not your department at any cost. It's how can my department be successful to help the Isle of Man be successful. I come back to that word because I do think those things are important. And the big issue at the moment still is clearly the Treasury Act. It needs serious amendment to make it more reflective of today's structure. And it isn't. It needs doing. It's a 1985 Act, I think, or 86. So that needs doing, and that would, to me... Sorry?
I think it's 85.
For 85, yeah. That to me is important. The other thing that's, I think, causing major problems for the structure of government and the island is being overly bureaucratic. It's a nightmare. The bureaucracy that's been introduced in the... I don't want to offend Howard here because I don't know what happened in your time, but certainly from my perception in the last 5 to 10 years is just out of this. It's just out of control. I'll just give you a good example. A woman came up to me the other week and said to me, I'm applying for a bus pass. Now, don't forget, a bus pass is only in the Isle of Man. She's over 65. They know she's over 65 because she's getting a pension. She's got the form. They want a passport photograph, or they want a driving licence, or X, Y, and Z. She says, I don't have a passport. I don't have a driving licence. I don't have this. What do I do? I said, go to the office and tell them you don't have any of that. Take a photograph of you and say, this is me. It's nonsense. It's a bus pass. And yet it's so bureaucratic. And that's just one little issue. It's magnified right across government, and to me is damaging government. It's slowing it down so much that everybody's scared of their own shadow. Things are not being done in a timely manner because the bureaucracy is controlling everybody to the nth degree. Don't get me wrong, you need bureaucracy to some degree, but not, I don't believe, to the degree we have. And over-regulation. Over-regulation's driving everybody mad. And we just seem to be more in, let's get regulations in, let's get bureaucracy in. How about let's earn some money to make the Isle of Man successful? And I do think we've swung too far. It's too much about what we can't do as against what we can do. And I think it's important politically, and the politicians lead this, not the civil servants. The politicians give the clear direction. We want to be successful. We want to see what we can do to make the Isle of Man good. What opportunities do we have? The civil service will follow that. If you give the message that we can't afford it, we need more bureaucracy, we need more regulation, they'll do that. And I do think the balance is causing the island a problem. And I do think that's an area, to me, more important than whether the ministerial system works, because I think the basis and the structure of the system works. It's what's behind it that's causing the problem. And that's my view from an outside point of view. And it was always there when I was there, but not as bad as it is today.
I suppose that's actually quite a good point, and I think Stu touched on that with the entrepreneurial attitude.
Yeah,
I suppose
absolutely.
the question that I'm getting at, I suppose, is do you think that the ministerial system itself is what's causing that risk aversion? Now that ministers are more accountable to Tynwald, now that people are more worried about how they're being perceived and taking responsibility, do you think it's the system and it's politicians that are being more risk averse, and so there's more form filling, more bureaucracy, more checks, more red tape to try and mitigate all of those perceived risks? The bus pass is a great example. Are Treasury worried that people are getting bus passes when they shouldn't? Is that the problem?
Yeah.
I don't know. But is it the system that's pushing that risk aversion, or do you think it's just other factors? It's political appetite, it's the
To be blunt, I think it's the people. Right. I mean, you know, we were controlled when I was Chief Minister. I'm sure that Howard was the same. Tynwald controlled ultimately what we do. You know, the powers we get come from legislation which Tynwald has to approve. The regulation of what we do is approved by Tynwald. It all goes back to Tynwald. It doesn't mean we can't do anything. But if you over-regulate, if you over-emphasise everything, and if members are overly criticised for just doing their job, it has an adverse impact. And people are worried about how far they put their head above the parapet because they want to get re-elected. I never apologised for being a politician. And I used to say, the day I got elected, the next day I'm looking to get elected again. And that's not an excuse. I'm a politician. I've got a job to do. I want to stay here because I believe in what I'm doing. And, you know, ultimately the people will decide. And that's what democracy is about. But if you tie us down too much, and I say yours, I'm not there now, but, you know, you tie the politicians down too much, everybody sits back instead of making the decisions that lead us forward. And, you know, people love leadership, you know. They don't want you to do not a lot. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of what goes on in government today. It's changed since I was there. I know the principles, I know the structure, I know it's changed. And come back to the Cabinet Office, I'm a big critic of the Cabinet Office. It's become a bureaucratic nightmare. It's massive. And lots of these responsibilities were with departments, and a minister had a clear responsibility. We now have a minister without portfolio to help the Cabinet Office. Really? And you have a Cabinet Office where you have a party political system. Why do you need it in a non-political system? The Chief Minister's meant to be the coordinator and what used to be the Chief Secretary's office. I'm not saying the Chief Secretary's office was perfect, it wasn't. It needed expanding, there's no doubt about that. But I think now it's gone a bit too far, where you've got this really quite large Cabinet Office in the centre. And I remember putting a view in on an issue on one of the consultations, and I made the point, because all the powers were going to the Cabinet Office, and I made the point, the powers are with the Council of Ministers, not the Cabinet Office. And I said, after all, the Cabinet Office is only a department. And I think people lose sight of that. It's just a department. But it's given the status that I think is far outweighs what it actually should be or is. And I do think that in itself, and that doesn't mean there's not hard-working people in there, because I know there are, I know some of them, but the system has created this thing in the centre. And I don't know how it's impacting on departments. You could tell me you've been in departments. Maybe they don't impact on you. But the outside impression to me is it's impacting on how effective government can be because it's too broad in its influences. Don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I'm more likely am because I've not worked in one.
I'll give a difference of opinion from...
which is why we're here.
Yeah, which is probably why we've been paired up.
Yeah, we'll fight outside.
Yeah. Is the Cabinet Office too big? And if it's well run, no. It's chaired, the Minister is the Chief Minister of the Cabinet Office. He can give well, it wasn't my day, you can give the day-to-day running of it to another Minister, but the Chief Minister was always the Minister for the... In fact, I thought constitutionally that was how it was. You're saying, no, that's not the case, but under the law, I'm sure, the Chief Minister had to be the Minister of the Cabinet Office.
So I think in your day, that you're right, you were the Minister of the Cabinet Office and the Chief Minister at the same time. Now we have a Cabinet Office Minister who I think replaced the old policy and reform role, and a Minister without portfolio and the Chief Minister. So there are 3 ministers sitting inside the Cabinet Office, but we actually have a dedicated Cabinet Office Minister.
Well, if you could let me know, because I thought legally it was written in statute that the Chief Minister was the I could be wrong on that one. So anyway, so I don't think no, because I'm going to say no to Tony's yes, as long as it's well run, because you wanted to do away with the silo mentality that departments, they each had their own section of maybe pensions, of pay. The Cabinet Office has combined that under one umbrella. So I like to think you're doing it by having the Cabinet Office. Yes, it's big. The health service, look at the budget, it's nearly a third of what we spend. So is that too big? So should you be splitting it off into various sectors, surgical, etc.? So my answer is no, the Cabinet Office was developed, I suppose, by my during my term, and probably in Alan Bell's time.
Alan started
to I'm not saying centralise things, but you wanted to do away with silo mentality, really. And if the Cabinet Office is well run, it will reduce silo mentality. And having 4 experts on pension negotiation in one area has to be better than having 9 people who also have to do another job and know a little bit about pension negotiations. So by centralising something and having people who do that for everyone, then hopefully you're getting a better outcome for the people who are getting, I'm picking on pensions as an example, for the people who are getting a pension, you're getting a better negotiation all around. The taxpayer is getting a better deal. So, as my caveat, if it's well run, the Cabinet Office isn't too big, because it's got a really important function that if each individual department kept on doing all those sections, you'd have too many different outcomes, and you wouldn't have key experience that you want in a specialist area. But obviously I'm disagreeing with my good friend and
that's all right, it's because I never had one. I was more of a dictator.
Is there a clear enough separation between the executive and the legislature?
Could you expand on that, please, Stu? You're saying the Attorney General and his legal draftsman team,
yes,
compared with Tynwald members.
Yeah.
So I just want to get my head. That's exactly what you're stating. You go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think the separation is fine. It again comes down to how you use it. The Attorney General's department is answerable through the Council of Ministers. And I mean, the Attorney General has a statutory independent role, which is important, I think, for the Isle of Man, that the law officer, the senior law officer, can advise government whether they want to hear the advice or not without fear or favour, to use the term. As far as the advice to members, I mean, my own personal experience, and I can only talk about I never had a problem with the Attorney General's chambers, even when I was opposing before the ministerial system and sometimes in the ministerial system legislation that I didn't think was the best thing to do. I think if that independence is recognised, there isn't a problem, and I think it is recognised. There's often been a view that the Clerk of Tynwald should have its own separate legal advisors, and I think in a perfect world that's fine, but we can't afford it, is to be blunt. If the advice wasn't there from the Attorney Generals and it wasn't given independently to members, that would be a different issue, but I've never heard a member saying the Attorney General won't give me that advice because he doesn't agree with me because it's against government policy. They don't say that. They say, this is what you can do if you want to take this forward, but that's a matter for you. And then the member often would go to the Clerk of Tynwald and say, what do you think of this amendment? And the Clerk of Tynwald might say, well, I'm not sure that bit works. I think that would work. You might want to go back and ask what, or I'll change that because I think this would be better. So members have that flexibility in the system. And again, it comes back to the point, we have to start from the basis that Tynwald is different to most other parliaments. If we don't start there, we'll spend a fortune creating systems that we don't need and, to be blunt, can't afford. It would be disproportionate to what we are.
I was going to ask you about collective responsibility in the Council of Ministers, but I think you probably covered that already.
Can I ask I haven't answered your question.
Right.
Just to back up, Tony, at no time have I had concern. I've never been told by a legal member, the Attorney General, or you can't, you're not to do that. Right. They'll give you advice and say, well, you can't do that because legally it's not correct. But I've never had anyone try to interfere in any way, shape or form with, if we had a policy, they would come up with ways of legislating, and then it was up to us to win the argument in Tynwald with the backbenchers. But if your concern was that it was too cosy a relationship and you were being led by the legal side, then the answer was no. Politics always, we were there for the people, and if we wanted to do something, they would advise us on how to go on that journey. But equally, if we naively thought we could do something and they say, no, you haven't got the powers to do that, then yeah.
Okay.
Can I just say, as a former speaker, I mean, we often had this raised with me as speaker, that a member got permission to take a private member's bill in, and they were saying, we're down the list, we'll never get there. I made a ruling, which was clearly accepted anyway because it was right, that a private member's bill was exactly the same status once it was approved by the Keys to be introduced as a government bill, and it would fall in the pecking order in its rightful place. It was not to be left behind. Now, I don't know if that still goes on, but that was a clear ruling I made as speaker. And you know, the Attorney General of the day accepted that because it had always been. But there was this perception growing, oh, it's a private member's bill, you just push back. It certainly wasn't in my day.
I think it's given 10% of a drafter's time.
Well, then that's a matter for the Speaker to sort out. And the Speaker, in my day, I would have gone to the Chief Minister and said, with the Attorney, I want a meeting. We need to sort this out. Members are as important as members as government members are as government members. And the legislation, there's nothing anywhere says because it's a private member's bill it goes further down the list or it has less time. Once it's approved by the House, and I mean there's not really a great rush at the moment when there's only 4 or 6 pieces of legislation going through in a year. Maybe less questions and more legislation would be helpful. Not that I could comment on that, of course.
Just to kind of broaden this out a little bit, because obviously we're talking about legislation here and we're not necessarily talking about the balance of power between the executive and backbench parliamentarians. Is there clear enough separation with the amount of hats, I suppose, that there are or are not on members of Legislative Council, members of Tynwald, rather than Legco and Keys? Is there clear enough water, do you think? Or is it not necessarily as clear as it could be?
I think you can answer that as backbenchers. Are you able to access? I would come across a situation where we would be getting the Attorney General to draft legislation for us, and the backbenchers would be getting the Attorney General to do amendments to that legislation, and it always worked perfectly. There was never any bias in my time. So
and same in mine. I mean, it was just straightforward. The Attorney General just accepted that was part of the role. It was a mixed role. It didn't mean the Attorney General or his chambers were disloyal to government. It just meant they were giving advice to a member who rightly expected that advice because that's how the system is. And as I say, you can have 3 or 4 legislative draftsmen in the Clerk of Tynwald's office if you want, but it will be very expensive and they'll be underworked. And most of the work they'll get won't be anything to do with legislation. I'm sure the Clerk of Tynwald will have plenty of jobs to keep them busy. It has to be practical. Can we afford it? Is it practical? Is it necessary? Separation. Again, I can only talk of my time. I never had a problem being a minister and being on a select committee and ripping to pieces my fellow minister because I was sat as a member of a select committee because my job was there as a select committee member, not as minister. And if I thought he was wrong or she was wrong, I'd give them heck. It's up to the individuals. You can't legislate for how people do their job. The people will decide whether they got the right people to do the job, and they'll do that every 5 years. And if you interfere with that system, you'll create chaos.
So we've talked, I think, a little bit about single legal entity, but haven't actually sort of delved into it too much. I think it was certainly more of a concern in your time, Mr. Quayle, as opposed to your time, Mr. Brown.
It never got anywhere with me.
But what you did talk about quite clearly earlier as when we were discussing Treasury and Treasury's role and the Cabinet Office and the Cabinet Office's role and the committees that sat under the Council of Ministers as the subcommittees in your time that then sort of delivered on cross-departmental policy work. You talked about the financing of it. I mean, I think that there are a number of different examples that we could pull out. I mean, at the start of this administration, we looked at the youth justice. And we had a recommendation that we put to Tynwald that was accepted around, applying budget to a piece of work that might sit between 2 different departments rather than allowing either one of them to lead on it and then pull that budget away, which would then lead to it falling away, the project itself. I think that there are a couple of examples, like the youth justice team, say, for example, that where that has gone wrong, and your comments there sort of speak to that somewhat. Do you think that would provide some degree of a fix? Is that something that you've thought much on? Because it seems like you have as a solution.
Well, there was a solution under the Council of Ministers Act that the 2010 Act would solve some of the issues I was concerned with. But from a single legal entity, I mean, it was first brought up in 2006. And then there was reform. So the Council of Ministers did move. They in 2014 there was changes to departments, etc., that Alan Bell brought in. So each time there's been improvements from a single legal entity. A report was done. If you just bear with me a sec, because I'm hopeless on remembering names. It was the Sir John Elvidge in a modernising ministerial government report in 2014, and then that was reviewed by a committee in 2017, which was a committee, I think Mr. Thomas, Mr. Boot, Miss Betterson and Mrs. Kane sat on, and they made a recommendation that we should have a single legal entity. Now, you can have a single legal entity and maintain departmental structure, which I would, if you're going to have a single legal entity, then you must maintain departmental structure, otherwise you would have a monster. In fact, I think there's a quote somewhere about everyone was agreed that you don't want some sort of mega. It was accepted by all that government cannot be a single monolith, and that has to be subdivided to allow it to be controlled and managed. So I wasn't opposed to single legal entity as long as it was done right, but there was one politician in particular who thought that single legal entity was the lily of the pink sort of elixir that was going to fix everything, solve all our problems, save billions, and it's not. It could help. It could do away with silo thinking. It could speed things up if it's in the right hands of the right people who are running it. So we weren't, as a Council of Ministers, totally opposed to single legal entity, but you go into it with, if you think just because you've got it and you've ticked that exercise, things are suddenly going to become perfect. Well, I don't think they would. You must keep the departmental structure because you've got one. But we just brought in the programme for government, which was approved in 2017, and that had the whole of Tynwald taking responsibility for various sections. We'd come up with measures of how did you decide whether that worked or not. What did success look like? It had never been done before. We implemented that, and I think, like a couple of these reviews, it was like, well, let's see how this works, and then if it doesn't work or it needs tweaking, then we could look at single legal entity again. There was never a majority. There was one very strong person who was adamant it must be brought in, and I don't think members were 100% against their view, but there wasn't a majority in Tynwald to bring it forward at the time. So I'm not discounting it, but I'm giving a caveat that it's not going to be the saviour of the island unless it's properly run and you've got the right people in doing it. It could improve some situations, as the person said, but if you just had it as one central area, it would be too unwieldy. Really. Personal viewpoint, obviously. I don't know, Tony, would you?
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, possibly the best constitutional attorney general that the Isle of Man had, certainly in the 20th century, was William Kane, and he was very much against single entity, and he used to refer to the Manx Ices case where the department was sued by Manx Ices for something that happened. I can't remember the ins and outs of it now, and he said if they win and we were a single entity, the Isle of Man government would be fined hundreds of millions of pounds. If it's a department, they will be fined tens of millions of pounds because it's against the department, and the Deemsters or whoever it is would look at the budget of the department and make it proportionate to their budget. And he made the point, really, which is very much what Howard has said, that it actually won't save the Isle of Man. It will just create this bigger entity called a single entity. What I do think would be a big benefit to the Isle of Man, and I've found this out as time's gone on, is actually when legislation is put together, that there should be provision put in where appropriate by statute that officers of departments have to work together when it's in the best interest of the Isle of Man, and not hide behind we're in this department. It's our responsibility. And I think that is something that we could do far more effectively across the board. For example, housing, social care, health care. Why is there not a link? You don't need a single entity to do that, but you might need a statutory duty. And if an officer fails in that duty, they can then be prosecuted. So I do think there's merit in that being examined as an issue. To see whether or not that's a way forward for the Isle of Man, because of the point, again, I come back to, we don't have a party political system, and therefore a lot of our legislation is based from the UK. Yes, we amend it, we make it change to what we need, and most cases that's fine, but there are some issues, and it's as times developed, I think it's fair to say, where now there might well be a need that regardless of the political view, the officers have a duty, a statutory duty and responsibility on behalf of the nation to act in the best interest of the nation, regardless of the politician. And I do think that's a serious issue that needs examining, and the sooner the better.
And this will be very pertinent to you again, Mr. Quayle, but around GDPR and applied LED regulations. Very frequently we tend to hear comments about, we can't share this, can't share that because of GDPR, because of applied LED. And there's a common understanding, I think, in and amongst certainly politicians. I'm not wishing to speak on behalf of Tynwald, but this is just what I've sort of personally heard when I've been working in departments or I've been working in Parliament, has been around GDPR and people sort of misunderstanding it, and misunderstanding the regulations, perhaps because they were complex. I think we copied across an awful lot of what we wanted to have here on the Isle of Man, with some degree of, I hate the word, but Maxification regarding GDPR and applied LED. And it was quite a prescriptive approach to legislating in what we did there. So is the type of thing that you're talking about, Mr. Brown, the type of thing that you're talking about, that type of thing where essentially you've got, very, very prescriptive legislation that's come from Whitehall, Westminster, and that we've then maxified, and we have sort of applied across the piece, and then people aren't sharing or collaborating? Is it that type of thing that is not necessarily direct single legal entity, but something that is sort of on the fringes of that needs fixing? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think there are occasions where information has to be shared because it's in the best interest of the individual and in fact the best interest of the service. It's how you restrict that and how you make it work. I don't know all the ins and outs of GDPR. I mean, we had data protection legislation when I was in, and we had an order that exempt members of Tynwald and members of local authorities from being restricted from getting information. So in other words, they were able to give it because we couldn't act on behalf of our constituents. When it first came in, we were going into departments saying, can't tell you. Hang on, I'm representing my constituent, they can't tell you. So it was nonsense. So there was an order brought in, that's gone now because of the new legislation, and I don't think there's any equivalent. And you're reliant very much on the officer whether they think it's appropriate to pass that information to the member, even if they've got permission from the individual. What happens in the UK or in Europe might not be appropriate for us. Yes, we have international obligations and we have to comply with them. I think we all understand that. But are you telling me that throughout every government in Europe, they don't transfer information across? There will be ways they do it, and it'll be legislated for because that's what it's about, protecting. And maybe that's an issue that needs looking at. But I think the issue I raised about the responsibilities of officers to act in the best interest of the government without it being a single legal entity by working together, being made to work together by law, and I think we've got an odd piece of legislation where that has been included, I think is a different issue, and it's one that should be looked at to see if we can make, where there are different professional views, those things come together for the best interest of the patient or whoever. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a bit out my league, that it's far too technical. I'm a very basic politician, me.
I doubt that. Go ahead.
I think it would have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. We weren't opposed in the Council of Ministers to single legal entity, but it wasn't the majority. It wasn't the will of Tynwald at the time. I think it was a free. If memory serves me correct, it was a free vote on it, and it didn't. I think it's been looked at in 2016, 2014, 2017, and it wasn't. And then the last few years of I know from my administration, we were flat out with COVID and Brexit, so it wasn't high on the agenda. But I don't know what this House has, whether this House has looked at it or not. Could I just ask, from a housekeeping point of view, I put my car on a 2-hour disc, and I don't have the luxury anymore now of a nice car parking space.
We wouldn't be too much longer, don't worry. So overall, how might we make the function of Tynwald itself better? We've talked about that an awful lot. So is there anything else that's kind of like cropped up into your heads as we've been moving along that might be pertinent?
My view is simple. The effectiveness of Tynwald depends on the membership. And if they are not willing to hold the government to account and use the system to hold them to account, then there's not much hope, is there? I mean, it seems to be the And again, I'm talking out of an outsider looking in now. Often when certain questions are answered in Tynwald, it seems to be getting muddled up between freedom of information requirements and Tynwald requirements. And Tynwald requirements are ultimate. And therefore, if Tynwald wants a report, Tynwald gets the report, unredacted. It's up to members how effective they are as a matter for them to individually answer to their electorate. And if they let us down, they'll soon find out about it.
I'll finish if this is the last question. On one of my pet hobby horses where I lost the vote, I think it was wrong. I think Tynwald voted to pay members' salaries the same whether they were on this sort of committee or on a departmental committee. And no offence, I've sat on both, so I know what it's like. It's any fool can throw a rock, but it takes real courage and hard work to roll up your sleeves and build something or fix something, put your head above the parapet, get dogs abuse. And I think Tynwald has put itself in an incredibly bad position now where people don't go on a department, they can just sit on a committee, and it's for the bad governance of Tynwald where and I'm not saying you don't work hard on a committee, but I know the amount of work I've done on select committees as a backbench, and it bore no relationship to my time as chair of planning, for example. The hours I had to do on that, where you're getting a lot of abuse from the public if you don't approve their plans, chairman of the MEA, and then I combined it. But so that's a little hobby horse. I lost the vote. It's the will of Tynwald. I have to take it. But as an outsider looking in, I think it was. I warned at the time. You've asked the question, so you've given me the opportunity to say that to me is a really bad move, which is damaging Tynwald.
Absolutely. I would add to that. If you don't pay people for extra responsibility, you are about the only area that doesn't. Anywhere in the world where you work, except a communist state, you get paid for extra responsibility. And it's undermined the system without a doubt. Absolutely. I agree with Howard 100%. There's a first.
Go.
But seriously,
brought us together.
In between the jesting, I think it's done a lot of damage.
Yeah.
You can't expect a member, especially with 2 seats. Why would one member in a 2-seat constituency work in a department for no extra pay and the other member wander around the streets being Mr. Nice Guy going to coffee mornings? It doesn't make sense, does it?
Isn't the problem, though, to your point earlier, you are a politician, and that's what you do, and people can't complain about the fact that you're looking towards the next election. So isn't the problem the fact that the public generally sees the rock thrower as the good politician?
I never had a problem. I was a minister for 15 years, 5 years chief minister. I never had a problem. I asked the questions I needed to ask. I didn't have to go to Tynwald or Keys to get things done. I did on some occasions, but a lot of your work goes on because you contact somebody today and say, why is that not sorted out? I mean, there's the day-to-day work and then there's the public face work, and they are 2 different things. You've got a job to do. And sorry,
if you genuinely want to change something, being in a department, understanding how it works. I know I was in the Department of Infrastructure, and I thought I'd have been put in DEFA with my knowledge, but I was in infrastructure, and as a result of negotiations with the minister, I was able to say, right, the railway track from Douglas to Peel, that's I want the people to be able to walk without going through bog, and I want them to be able to go out as families and exercise, bikes and everything. Absolutely. I'll give you my support for Peel Road development if the hardcore that comes out of Peel Road is used crushed to recycle and properly drain the railway tracks so that the people of the island can walk and my constituents will benefit. So I was able to look after my constituents whilst taking responsibility for a departmental job because I was able to be in there and work. So I just think it's, as long as you explain to your constituents, I did a letter once, a term just saying what I'd got up to, but it's my hobby horse, but I think it was a really retrograde move, and you're doing it now. You've asked me the question, so you let me in on that one. So thanks.
How big a problem is it, do you think?
Big.
But yeah, if people just go elected and throw stone, who's going to be a minister? You can't just get elected and be a minister. I refused when I was chief minister to allow first-time people to go straight in as ministers. I thought you needed at least a few months to cut your teeth, learn the rules, see how things work before you went in as a minister. And I didn't do anyone for the first couple of years. You've got departments are good ways to learn the ropes, to understand what happens in the department. So if you're not happy, you can fix it. You can fix it from inside, and it's really important that. And if we have elected members who don't have any departmental experience, and there's a clear out at the next election, and all you get are people who've not served in departments re-elected, then who's going to sit on those departments and oversee what's going on and look after the interests of the public, who we are, sorry, not anymore, no mandate, but you are there as an elected member to serve if you haven't got those skills and experience. But so I think it's incredibly important.
I mean, I think the big thing is it's not compulsory to be on the department, but I think it's a bit nonsensical to say, come and work on the department, work all hours and we're not paying you any more money. That doesn't work anywhere else. If you've got extra responsibility, you're paid for it. And to be blunt, the vast majority of the public don't care. What they care about is they want to live in a nice place with a good quality of life and opportunities. They don't want you wandering around being Mr. Nice Guy who only asks questions. Anyone can ask a question. Doesn't mean it happens. I can tell you as a minister, we get asked questions. Some were genuine, so you backed them. You did what you could. Others were just a question for the sake of a question, and you knew it. I mean, how on earth do you get experience if you're never in government working in a department? I'll tell you now, you don't. What Howard just said, you could be 10 years in Tynwald, never on the department, and if you suddenly had to go on one, you might as well be in your first year in Tynwald, because you haven't got a clue how a department works, how the legislation works, how to deal with civil servants. It's just nonsensical. We're too small for this. It's different in the UK. They have backbenchers in the UK because they've got 600 of them. They've got to do something with them. So not many of them are actually in government. In the Isle of Man, we've got 33. And the Isle of Man, you know, regardless what people say, there's a lot of work to do in the Isle of Man if the Isle of Man's to be successful. And my view is simple. When I elect somebody, I expect them to work in government. I don't expect them just to be a member of Tynwald.
And I think that we'll leave it there on a point of agreement. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, that's a whole rabbit hole opened.
Thank you very much for your time, Tony Brown, OBE, and also Mr. Howard Quayle, CBE.
Thank you.
We'll now sit in.
It's too late, Howard. You've got £65 fine there.
I'll be sending.
It's not send it to Jonathan.
The Jonathan